Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here to present another video to help you improve your chess game. Someone asked me what my FIDE rating was. It's 2285. Then people say, what's that? That's a CM. And they say, well, why don't you gain to 15 points and become an FM? Well, that's a lot easier now if you're young than it was when I was playing, when it was pretty difficult. And at my age, the answer is it's never going to happen. More likely my rating would go down than up if I tried to get the 15 points. In fact, not more likely, just almost absolute. All right, so let's take a look today. One of my students suggested I use this position as a basis for a video. And when we were going over this position, it's obviously white to move. He's the one in check. I said to my student, we're going to bring knowledge and then we're going to bring skills to figuring out what white should play here. And I said, what kind of knowledge do you think you'd want to bring to this position? And I said, okay, well, let's start listing. One of the things that you want to bring is that material is the most important part of evaluation, maybe other than getting your king checkmated. So here, if you're not counting the material to do the problem, then you're missing a big point of it, which is at the current position, white has one extra pawn. So white is up a pawn. All right, that's very important. Then the next question comes, if two really good players are playing, let's say Stockfish against Alpha Zero or something like that, how far ahead would one of them have to evaluate the position before we might think that the engine is not just better, but it's actually going to win the game if both sides play perfectly? And generally the break-even point early in the game is something like 1.0 pawns. For some engines it's a little higher than that, but it's somewhere around 1 pawn advantage. So no matter how good you are, even if you're not good enough to win when you're up a pawn, you should be aware that being up a pawn is enough to often win the game. So if you can maintain a pawn advantage and everything else is equal, that might be enough to win the game if you play perfectly. Okay, so that's a piece of knowledge that we're going to bring to the position. White's up a pawn, and a pawn is maybe enough to win the game if we can take it. What other pieces of knowledge do we need to bring? Well, how about a tactical pattern? If you do the John Baines Chess Tactics for Students book, there's a problem that's the first problem in the book where the black queen and the black king are both lined up on an open E file, and later on white tries to get a rook onto that file and pin the queen to the king and get a tactic to win material. So I call this issue that these pieces are lined up like that seeds of tactical destruction. A seed of tactical destruction is something wrong with somebody's position that tells you you might have a tactic. All right, so in this position we are bringing to the position the knowledge that black has seeds of tactical destruction, that same kind of seed that we saw in the Bain book, with the queen and the king lined up on an open E file. All right, what other information do we need to bring? One of the pieces of information we need to bring is one of the most important moves in every opening is castling. Castling is extremely important. I tell my students, if both sides can castle and one of them doesn't, let's say you're watching two little kids play a game and they both learned how to play within the last few weeks, and one of them castles and the other one just leaves his king in the middle, I tell people, bet on the king, on the kid whose side castled. He's probably going to win the game. And a lot of the students who come to me, adults as well as younger players, they very often don't value castling as much as they should, and they consistently get into danger by putting off castling and putting off castling, and they're doing what I call having a better idea, which is rather than getting all their pieces into play, they want to get their knight to e5, they want to do all those things, and they put off castling until a lot of times it's too late, and then they end up losing the game. So castling is important. Sometimes I tell them, what's the most important move in almost every opening? Well, to some extent, it's castling. It's the only move where you can move two pieces where they belong. And you can also get your most important piece, your king, out of the middle. So it's really important to be able to castle. Okay, so that's a piece of information we're bringing to the board as well, which is castling is really, really important. If we can't castle, then that's dangerous. What's another piece of information? Well, if we can get the queens off the board, then castling becomes less important. It's less dangerous to have your king in the middle when the queens are off the board than it is when the queens are on the board. For instance, Let's get rid of this position for a second. Let me copy the position so we don't lose it forever here. Copy. So let's say we start a new position and we have e4, d6, d4, e5. Now the main move for white here is knight f3 transposing into the Philidor, but most lower players say, oh, I can stop him from castling. And they play d takes e, d takes e, queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, and they go, aha, I stopped him from castling. Well, that's true, and white will probably want to castle queenside here to get his rook on the open d file where the king is. But black's not in that much danger here. For instance, white could attack the e-pawn and black can guard it, and now he's not as much worried about those open files, open diagonals on the king side because his king's no longer there. And if white plays something like knight to c3 now, black could play a move like c6, keeping the knight out. If white develops the bishop, black can tuck the king away on c7. And even though white has more pieces out, without the queens on the board and with the king pretty safe off the open file, you know, black's position is quite playable here. So if you can get the queens off the board and you can't castle, then the pain of not being able to castle is often much, much less. So we have to bring that knowledge to our position as well. Let's go back to our position. Okay, so now we know all these things that we've already talked about. You know, castling is really important and so on. Okay, now we have to start analyzing the position based on a lot of these things that we know. And one of the problems is not only is white in check, but his pawn on d4 is attacked by the pawn on c5, and if white makes a random move, black will play c takes d4 on the next move and get back to material equality. So now let's say that white treasures castling so much that he only wants to consider moves that will allow him to castle. All right, well, let's list all the legal moves for white. White can play queen e4, queen e3, queen e2, bishop e3, king to d1, king to d2, and king to f1. All right, it's always a good idea when you're in check to list all the legal moves. One of those moves, queen to e4, puts the queen on prise. That's probably not our best move. We could probably eliminate that one, but the other 6, maybe. So let's say we're trying to castle. What move would allow us to castle? Well, if we play bishop to e3, see if you can visualize that without me moving it on the board. If you play bishop e3, we should be able to castle on the next move, but there's a problem with bishop e3. What is it? Well, the problem is that when black wins back the pawn with c takes d4, he's hitting the pinned bishop with the pawn, and now if white castles, he loses the bishop. So bishop e3, c takes d4. Now white's the one with the pinning problems on the e-file, not black. And white has lost the pawn back, and even though he's able to castle on bishop e3, it's going to cost him that pawn on d4 and the bishop. Maybe he'll get the pawn back when he recaptures on e3. But he'll end up down a bishop, and that is going to be unacceptable. So bishop e3 allows us to castle. What else could we play that allows us to castle? Well, queen e2 blocks the queen, and white would then hope to do something like trade queens and save the pawn on d4, but unfortunately it's black's move, and black could simply play something like c takes d4 after queen e2, getting his pawn back, and now white can't castle because he needs the king to guard the queen. For instance, queen e2, c takes d4 castles, and then queen takes e2, and white loses the queen. So if black wants to stop white from castling after queen e2, he could just play queen takes e2, king takes e2, and of course now white can't castle, and then play c takes d4. Or he could say, I'm in no rush, I could play c takes d4 right away, and white still can't castle. So it looks like queen e2 will, get him out of check, and we'll end up with an even material, but it doesn't allow you to castle. Let's look at queen to e3. Queen to e3. Well, that looks like we'll be able to castle on the next move. Queen to e3. If black now plays queen takes e3 check, white can take back with the pawn or the bishop, and both of them would guard the pawn on d4. For instance, queen e3, queen takes e3, bishop takes e3, c takes d4, bishop takes d4, and white remains up a pawn. So that would be good, but the problem after queen e3 is the black queen is well guarded by the bishop, the knight, and the king, And after queen e3, black can simply play c takes d4, attacking the queen. And now white can't play queen takes d4 and get his pawn back because it's pinned to his king. And if he played something like queen takes e7, black could play bishop takes e7, and again, black has won a pawn. So in that line, queen e3, white will be able to castle, but it will cost him a pawn. What we're doing now is we're doing analysis. We're backing up the knowledge we had before the analysis. Now let's say that we think that castling is so important, especially with queens on the board, that we're going to automatically eliminate any move that doesn't allow us to castle. Well, that's going to be a problem because so far we've only found one safe move that allows us to do that, and it's only safe insofar as it loses a pawn, which is not really safe. We've seen that queen e3, c takes d4, queen takes e7, something recaptures on e7, and then white can castle. But that move allows us to castle, but we've lost the pawn. But that's the only move that we can play. If we think castling is so important that we can't give up the pawn, then, we would be willing to lose the pawn by playing queen e3. Here's an interesting point. Suppose I didn't show you this position, and I just said to you, you're playing a random game with a random position, and it's early in the game, and you have a choice. You can either be up a pawn, but you can't castle for the rest of the game. Your king's stuck in the center. Or you could be even in material, but your king is safely tucked away when you're castled. Which would you rather have? Well, a lot of times my students answer questions like that with answers like, well, it depends on the position. And I say to them, well, everything depends on the position, but I'm asking you on the average which one you'd rather do. In this particular case, for this particular question, if it was just the average and you asked me over all possible positions which I'd rather do, I'd probably rather be up the pawn and not be able to castle than castle and not be up the pawn. But actually, this one is one of those answers which is highly position dependent. So if we're answering in general, we could answer things in general like, over every possible position, how many pawns on the average is a knight worth? That's the average value of a knight. Well, we can answer questions like that. In fact, if you haven't read Grandmaster Larry Kaufman's articles on the values of the pieces, then I have a copy of one of those on my website. Grandmaster Kaufman wrote an article called The Evaluation of Material Imbalances. If you just Google that, then he talks about the average value of the pieces. Okay, well, when you're looking at a position whether castling is more important than losing a pawn, castling has no value associated with it. I talked about this in one of my earlier videos called Not All Bads Are Equally Bad, where you have to give things values that don't have values. And being able to castle and not being able to castle, we don't have an average value for that. We can't say that's worth 0.7 pawns or 1.4 pawns or anything like that. We don't have those kind of values. And it is very, very, very variable. We just showed an example in the opening after e4, d6, d4, e5, d takes e, queen takes d8, king takes d8, where black couldn't castle, but it didn't cost him that much with the queens off the board so early. So here, in this position, it's very position dependent. The question is, if white gives up castling here and tries to hold on to the pawn, is that going to be worth it? Well, the only way we're going to tell that is to look at the lines where that actually might occur and see if white's going to get into big danger by doing that. All right, so we've already thought that the only ways to castle with bishop e3 loses the bishop, queen e3 loses a pawn. So let's look at lines where we can't castle. Well, if we put the king on f1 and he plays e takes d4, then we're just losing the pawn for pretty much nothing. So king to f1 doesn't seem to do much. But if we move the king to the d file, now we're back to that first problem in John Bain's Chess Tactics for Students, which is white now has a threat. After king d1, the threat is rook e1, pinning the queen to the king. So black doesn't have time to play c takes d4 because rook e1 will win the queen for the rook. So temporarily that saves the pawn, but that's the problem. It's only temporary. We have to now analyze, does black have a way to still win the pawn after king d1, and now the white's king is stuck in the center where it could be in great danger. So we have to start looking at candidate moves for black. Well, he has basically two ways he can stop white from playing rook e1 and winning the queen. He can move the king off of that line, or he can move the queen off of that line. He can't really put another piece in the front of that line. For instance, king d1, knight f6, rook e1, knight e4 still loses the queen to rook takes e4. So bringing out a piece doesn't work. You have to move the queen off the e-file or move the king. Well, when I showed this position to my student who recommended the video and I said king d1, I said, suppose you want to move your king off the line. How many king moves do you have? And he said, I have 2, king to d8 and king to d7. And I said, that's not correct. And he said, what do you mean? I know how to move the pieces. King d8, king d7, there's only 2 king moves. And I said, well, no, I don't think so. And he's like, you're kidding me, right? And I'm like, no. So finally, after a while, he realized, oh, black can castle queenside. Well, in chess, castling is considered a king move rather than a rook move. It's not a king and a rook move. It's considered a king move. That's one of the reasons why you have to move the king first. It's not the only reason. The main reason to move the king first is if you move the king too and take your hand off, you must be castling. If you move the rook first and take your hand off, that's a rook move, and your opponent can say to you, hey, it's a rook move, you took your hand off, you got to move it. If you move the king too and take your hand off, then it has to be castling. Now, we're talking over the board. If you're doing it on the internet, you can't move the rook first. So people who actually play on the internet have learned to castle with the king first, even better than people who play over the board. All right, so after king d1, let's say black does castle queenside, because not only does that get the king off the e-file to stop rook e1 from winning the queen, but it also puts a second piece attacking the pawn on d4. And now white has 2 pieces attacking the pawn on d4 and only 1 guarding the pawn on d4. I'm sorry, none guarding the pawn on d4. So you might think, uh-oh, white's in big trouble now. But when somebody's attacking something twice and it's guarded 0 times, that doesn't mean you can't save it. It just means you probably can't guard it. And in fact, you can save it by pushing it. So let's actually analyze that. King to e1, king to d1, castle queenside, and now this pawn is attacked twice. Can we save it? Yes, we can. We can push it like that. Now it should be obvious that the pawn on d5 is pretty safe. It's attacked once, it's guarded twice, but also black cannot play any break moves with pawns against that pawn on d5. His c-pawn has already gone past that pawn, so he doesn't have a move like c6. His e-pawn doesn't exist, so he doesn't have a move like e6. So breaking up those pawns to open up the center to get at the white king becomes a lot more difficult. Now, would a master stop here and say, all right, I got away with it, let's hit the clock, this is what I'm going to do? No, because A, when you see a good move, you might want to look for a better one. And B, black has break moves on the other side of the pawn chain to try to break down the pawns. So, for instance, a move he could try to play is maybe something like b5. And the idea is that if white's pawn on c4 disappears, all of a sudden the pawn on d5 gets vulnerable. But luckily for white, he can back up the pawn chain and play something like b3. And now if black ever captures b takes c4, we just replace it with a pawn. Black could now do something like queen e5 and hit the rook that's hanging on a1. But it looks like white has some moves that he could easily save the rook. For instance, he could say, good, I'm up a pawn. Let's trade queens. Trade or retreat, Mr. Black. Trade or retreat is a big idea in chess. When you're winning, this idea that you say to your opponent, trade or retreat. Here, if black trades, that's good for white because it goes in the endgame. But if he retreats the queen, right now, the queen can't go anywhere that would create any giant threats. And that would give white time to continue his development and maybe even attack the black king, or at least trade everything off and try to win the endgame. So at this point, I would kind of stop and say, looks like I got away with it at this point. All right, let's go back and let's say that we have any other ways. Well, we could also play king to d2. King to d2 has the same threat of rook to e1, and if he castles, we still have d5. Now, in an earlier video, I talked about the concept of piece domination and move domination. Here, I would use move domination. I would say, if I'm going to move my king to the d-file, and king d2 and king d1 are equally safe, then king d1 does pretty much everything that king d2 does, but king d2 blocks the knight and blocks the bishop, which, everything else being equal, is a big detriment for white. So if king d2 and king d1 are roughly equally safe, then I'd much rather have my other pieces be more active. So I think king d1 does everything king d2 does, and more by not blocking the queenside pieces. All right, so we've kind of gotten rid of castle queenside. Does that already mean that king d1 is the best move? No, because we haven't looked at the lines where black moves the queen. Maybe he can move the queen somewhere and create a big threat that white doesn't have time to do things with. So let's look at that. King to d1. Where would black put the queen? Well, if he puts it on f6, we can trade queens. That would help him develop the knight, but then we could play d5 and our pawn is safe again. Or if he plays queen f6, we might be able to just play d5 right away, but then he could take our queen, queen takes f3, g takes f3, and mess up our kingside pawns. That's probably not the best move, but it's not terrible, but it's not as good. All right, where else could black put the queen? Well, he could put it on the d file and threaten the d pawn again. What could white do? All right, so queen to d6 is a possibility, queen to d7, queen to d8. On all those moves, white could just play d5 and save the pawn, or he could first play rook e1 check, and when black, let's say, plays bishop e7, then he could play d5, and again, it's looking like, and if black then plays b5, again, we have b3, something like that, holding up the center. So it's starting to look like, even if we play king d1 and he moves the queen, that white can still save the pawn and end up a pawn. And then we have that monster question, which is, would we rather have a position like king to d1, castle, d5, or would we rather have the position where we give him back the pawn and castle, like queen e3, c takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop e7, castle. So now we have to do what's called evaluation. Evaluation is who stands better, how much better, and why. And we said, other than maybe king safety, the number one thing in evaluation is material. And here, white has 6 pawns, black has 6 pawns, both sides have a bishop, a knight, and 2 rooks. So the material is even, and even though white is castled, it is an endgame, and in endgames, the king could just as well maybe be in the center. So it looks here like this position is not much favorable for white, maybe a slight advantage for white. But what happens if we play the move where we save it? Let's say we play king d1, he castles queenside, white plays d5 to stop rook takes d4 check. Would we rather have this position? Well, the white king can't castle, but how does black's pieces get to his king? The rook can't easily. If he plays rook to e8, for instance here, trying to bring the queen down, looks like white could just play something like bishop e3 and block the line and then get ready to bring the knight out and then bring the rook up and over, or maybe bring the king over and then bring the rook over that way when the king comes up. So it looks like white's getting out of this with the extra pawn here. So my strong guess is that it's better not to castle here. It's better to play king to d1. Well, is that always going to be true? No. In this case, we had to look at all the specifics of the position to figure out whether castling, enabling white to castle, was better than making a move that would purposely put our king in the middle. Is that always going to be true? Of course not. We have to evaluate it. Let's ask Stockfish what the difference is. Stockfish, after king to d1, what's the evaluation of the position? All right, there's the evaluation in parentheses over there. I don't know if you can see it, but Stockfish says white's ahead by about 3 1/3 pawns here. 3 1/3 pawns, well, that's a giant lead. We said at the start of the video, +1 is enough to win the game. And it says black's best move is queen d7. White should check. Black should play bishop e7. White should play d5. And that's about as good as both sides could do. How about if white decides to castle and play queen e3? Queen e3, c takes d4, queen takes e7. Now he suggests knight takes e7, and let's castle just for the fun of it. Castle, and Stockfish says the position is almost dead even. Minus 0.08, minus 0.2, minus 0.15, and so on. Okay, so it's not even close. This would be a case where purposely deciding not to castle would be the right idea. Would you watch this video and then run out and say, gee, anytime Mr. Heisman says anytime I have a choice between losing a pawn or castling, I should not castle and save the pawn instead? Well, that's definitely not true. That would be a disaster to think that that would always be true. You really have to look at each position and decide for yourself. This one really wasn't that hard, but sometimes it is very hard, and even people at my level can easily make mistakes making that judgment on which they'd rather have. But this one really wasn't that difficult. So the right answer is to play king to d1. My student in the game said that he automatically eliminated every move that doesn't allow you to castle. Well, that immediately would narrow you down to moves that are not as good. And I had an earlier video a few weeks ago, which I think was a really good one, called Filters and Masks. And when you automatically eliminate any move that doesn't allow you to castle, then you're filtering that out. And when you're filtering that out in this kind of position, you're actually filtering out by far the best move. And that's something you don't want to do, so that's a bad filter. Let's show another example of a filter that would make a lot more sense to do that. Let's say you're in some sort of Bogo Indian here. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6, queen's Indian, e3, bishop b4 check. Okay, well, here, what are all the legal moves? Knight c3, knight d2, bishop d2, knight f d2, queen to d2, and king to e2. Well, here you can kind of filter. One of the things you would say is, I'm not going to put the queen in the way and lose my queen for a bishop. Well, that's a good filter. And you could say, what's the advantage of playing king e2 and not putting a piece in the way? And the answer is basically nothing. So king e2 here would be just a silly move that would take your castling possibility away from you. And here, unlike the puzzle that we did for the rest of the video, here you could pretty much quickly say king e2 is not that good. And if we ask the engine what the top 4 moves are here, you can see it is knight bd2, bishop d2, knight c3, and knight f d2. That queen to d2 and king e2 don't get into the picture. If we go to the 5th best move, of course it's going to be king to e2. But look how much worse it is for king e2. You're basically losing the right to castle for nothing. And instead of having a nice little advantage like white would normally have with knight c3 or knight bd2 or bishop d2, which have you up about a third of a pawn, now you'd be down by 1 1/3 pawns if you gave up the right to castle. So in some positions like this, you can filter real quickly and get rid of the moves that don't allow you to castle. But in other positions, you can't do that. Again, that's what makes chess fun. Not everything's so easy. All right, please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. And if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, great. And like the video, that's good too. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.